Osrith pushed her feet as firmly as she could into the stone floor. Talk calmly. Don't provoke a fight or he might not let you take Edra. Then, a look of hurt passed over his features, and he turned his from Osrith. When you left before. When I left before Domhnall were trying to arrange my marriage then. Osrith snapped. You, now? She knew it had been the wrong thing to say, and when she added, and I learned my home is here, not in Wessex or Bibbenburg or anywhere near my brother. Later, Osrith knew she should have turned then, turned and left, waited it out in the kitchens, by the elderly Glymery's nighttime fire. But instead she stopped too long, and Constantine found more words. And you will be with him. It was no question. Him? Osrith asked. As far as she knew, Finan might be dead, or gone from Utid's side. Besides, it was because she was intent on seeing Edward. The word fell from his lips as a stone might from a cliff, cold and leaden and heavy. Perhaps Osrith should have known then. Well, of course. He is the king of Wessex, and Bicca lives in the palace at Winchester. And he will sleep with you, of course. He spat onto the stone floor and narrowed his eyes. And he may try and I will refuse. Osrith replied, briefly. Because he was on his third marriage already. More heirs of Alfred's line he could produce the better, especially with Aethelstan still called a bastard by those who listened to the Wessex lords. And she had intended on giving it to him anyway, the silver, all she owned. The next morning, she knelt to the sheepskin and pulled out a cloth bag. And what is this? He eyed the brown fabric with just a hint of hunger. My wealth. All of it. Constantine looked from the bag to Osrith, and then folded his hand around it. Yet, he would be right to suspect she had money in Wessex, and he would be right. She had plenty, most of it taken as spoils by her brother and liberated by Osrith while he was indulging of women of many repute. If she wanted to leave, she had the means, which is why Constantine had taken the precaution to send Sainid with her, and she had no doubt that Constantine's general and head of the royal household guard would act on the king's word to the letter. And, Constantine continued, I have a gift, from king to king. He held up the leather-covered book, fanning open the first page. Osrith stared at it, recognizing the script. It was like the book finished at Kells with the squid ink Osrith had been sent to find from Lockfoyle, but not as richly decorated. Clearly the Chaldees monks had been busy making a copy in the Ionian style. He is no scholar, Osrith said, finally. Constantine snorted. That's a waste, all kings should be scholars. Alfred was a scholar. Constantine brought his face close to Osrith's. Were that I had met him, I am sure we would have had much to discuss. And Edward. Suddenly, he dropped the Gospels, and touched Osrith's face, turning her towards him. Does he kiss you like I do? How does he touch you? He drew her face closer to him, pressing his lips to hers while pressing his hand between the folds of her shirt, working it down her stomach before making his way to her buttock. My lord king. Osrith managed, breaking apart. I am not Domhnall. Constantine roared at her, pulling her shirt apart so it exposed her. You called him that. I was the boy you once shamed by fighting for me. He analyzed what was before him, breasts bound, as a Norseman had once taught her so they would not get in the way in a fight. If not Edward, who is it you leave me for? Is it the other one? Finan. Water. Cold water from a different reality that those names invoked washed over her as Constantine used a sharp blade to hack through the binding of cloth. May the sight take your spirit. He screamed, as Osrith tried to fight him off. No. Protested Osrith as her breasts came free. But Constantine took in each hand, mauling them, before bending his head down, seeking one the nipple as he fumbled for the other. Osrith felt faint as she struggled against his assault. Was the light dimming? Was Nine Fingers fucking her mouth again? The air smelt of sweat and pre-cum as he bit the nipple he was sucking, and she tried to kick him off, recoiling when Osrith's foot met flesh and she realized Constantine had dropped his breeches. His cock was hard and he stopped grinding her nipple with his teeth, breathing heavily onto her chest as his hand dropped to it. Then, The king of Alba worked himself hard, his left hand squeezing rhythmically at her breast as he got lost in his wank. The king strained back with the effort, then glared at Osrith, his spy, with a look she knew. And what followed it, in and out, he would go with his cock in her cunt, and she would feel it poorly for she was not ready. It was nothing, if she only thought of it as an and out. Osrith closed her eyes. The whole world went black as the sea splashed coldly on her cheek. But it wasn't the sea. He was too late to rape her. Too soon. Constantine had come, with masturbation perfected over the years, ejaculating over face and neck and breasts, the viscous liquid oozing its way between them, slowly down her stomach. The door closed, and a man stood in front of it looking between Osrith, who had crumpled to the floor, and his cousin. It was Domhnall, Prince of the Aelch, back long in exile, after 20 years of successful reign. Constantine said nothing, as he wiped his cock clean on her bindings. Then, he marched past Domhnall without a word. After the door of the throne room banged closed, Domhnall, with much care, sat by Osrith, as the feeling that her hands and feet were being bound to a rock, immobile, as the darkening green sea was about to overcome her. She was shaking uncontrollably. Domhnall patted her gently on the arm. Osrith turned her head to him, and she let him help her to her feet. When he realized her tunic and shirt were utterly destroyed, he sought for a covering, before undoing the clothes bundle packed for the next day's journey, and looked away as she fashioned it round her body, to preserve what little dignity she had left. Then, she sat on the rugs covering the raised block on which the oak alpinthine sat. Domhnall sat next to her. "He does not wish me to take Edra," she justified, addressing Tpiflaw. "He thinks I will leave her with her real father. He is angry." Domhnall huffed his dissent, and she turned to look at him. "You always take his side, Osrith," he replied, harshly. "Why do you always do that?" Then, he got up, and trod mind-weary, to the door. Osrith followed him. "It is good to see you again," she called. Domhnall turned, and nodded. He was older than Constantine, but looked younger. While Constantine's short reign had been troubled, Domhnall had enjoyed salad days in a relatively Norse-free Irian. Care though had taken its fee from his forehead, where premature wrinkles sat between his still long, black, becurtained hair. "Will you come back?" He stepped towards Osrith, a man she esteemed highly and respected above so many others. "Will you?" Domhnall sighed. "If Neil agrees that I may stay, then no." "I will," Osrith replied, hoping that Constantine's predecessor's spirit heard her. "I swore to him once, swore to Domhnall." "I was there," Domhnall smiled. "You swore to Flann that Domhnall was your lord, swore to Constantine and all those who come after. That's a promise for life." "That's how I felt," Osrith conceded. "And now? Now you know your brother?" "Yes. Constantine only did what you tried to do to me once." To his credit, Osrith saw him flinch. He had been an angry young man, then. "My brother Uhtred ensured what happened to me through blackmail to an odious man happened. Innocents would have died for the simple fact that they were heathen Britons." But it had not been simple. Uhtred had discovered something she had done, which, in his mind, had caused harm to the person he held most dear. He did not know Osrith was his sister. He did know that hundreds of people would be hanged, children slaughtered by the dying great king had Ethelwold acted on his threat. What would that have done, to these people whose ways and language Osrith felt she belonged to most in the world? "My place is here," Osrith concluded firmly. "But Edra's father is dying." "My father too." "Your father?" "At Ernom. Our priest. A more godly man you would never find in the world, except, perhaps, Fergus." Domhnall laughed. "Well, Culdees does indeed work for Fergus, regular meals and ale in exchange for bookkeeping and the odd Norse incursion to keep his sword whetted." He held out his arm. Osrith took a glance at it, and then they were young again, friends, where they walked and talked and laughed, and she curled hers around it. "You deserve your blade," Domhnall said, nodding down at Bué, scabbard scuffed where Constantine had kicked it. "My servant did not. He died at the Battle of Combe Sills Monastery, anyway." maybe he did need this. Osrith laughed, a laughter which, uncharacteristically, turned into sobs as she looked at her blade. Domhnall pulled her close and held her. He always had the ability to make her let her guard down, and make her feel better at the same time. When Osrith had finished sobbing, and withdrew from Domhnall's shoulder, she pulled back in his arms far enough to see his face. "I know what happened to Ethm," Osrith said softly, and was not surprised when he pushed her back by the shoulders, giving her a serious look. She was on Finan's ship, Utad's ship. She and Finan married after the Slava was broken up, and they were happy, living not far from Ibbenburg. Domhnall still stared at her. When eventually he did speak, his voice was quiet, almost reverent, the words drying in his throat. "Does she live?" Osrith shook her head. "A fever. Finan was with her," he said. "And she was happy?" Osrith thought of the night he had told her. He had barely known her, and Utad's grief for Gisela had affected all of his men. He said so. Domhnall pulled her close again, and they held one another as if they were the last two humans in the world. "Make it up with Neil, if you can," Osrith whispered by his ear. "Agree, and ally against Don Chada." Osrith knew in her heart she would never see Neil again. She remembered the kind little boy she had cared for, interested in even the smallest beetle as well as the largest horse. Yet, Domhnall had arrived again after Mia's death, after Flansinner's huge flame-haired son, Don Chada, had promised to support Neil's kingship of the Aelch, the northern Ui Neil as well as his high kingship at Tara as long as Neil rejected Domhnall. And, once Domhnall had gone, Don Chada had betrayed Neil and put his own man, Flathbuttark mac Murchado. But Osrith had trouble believing Neil would be swayed to reject his brother. Little grubby Knees had even married poor, destitute Gormalath who, having been overthrown by the Ulaid prince to whom Flann had arranged her to wed, but twice by the king of Connaught. She had literally had to walk back to Doia, and the soft-hearted Neil refused to hear advice when he married her. This also suggested to Osrith that he was not bent on legacy, that he may accept his brother, for Gormalath had been unable to produce even one child, dead or living, with either of her former husbands. Osrith felt Domhnall move under her arms and she stepped away, despite wanting so desperately to cling to him for much longer. "Will I see you again?" she gasped, in between ebbing jerks of emotion. Domhnall moved one hand onto her back, and supported her head. "I am certain of it," he whispered, by her ear, then stepped aside as Sainid strode towards them, new jerkin and shirt in hand. Osrith didn't watch him go, instead made deliberations and dressing, wiping off as much of Constantine's ejaculate from her body as she could with her old, now rag clothes. She knew if she saw Domhnall retreat she would wish to tear after him, to go with him, across the land to Glashku, a boat to Iona and across to Ratlin then to the Donegal coast to Doia. In the 25 years since she had gone, in fellowship with Finn Olai, tagged, and Fergus, in service with Domhnall and companion to Constantine, she had never forgotten Irian, the journey all that way. But she was going on a journey of her own, to Wessex and Sainid was going with her. Sturdy, capable, reliable Sainid who, for some reason just wanted to keep her like a bird, for his own, gauged. Should she ever crave the quiet life, Osrith knew that, if she agreed to his ongoing unspoken question, this would be the one man she would marry. Later, as Osrith sat in her old corner in the back room of the kitchen, hooves thudded on the grass outside. Domhnall had at last gone to reclaim his throne and, God willing, make an alliance with Neil Glundube. He had tried to ally with Neil against Flathbuttark mac Murchado, with Constantine's help, and on both occasions Neil had brought his army out onto the field of battle to oppose him. This time he was alone. And a part of Osrith's heart, a piece of her soul left that night with the Ui Neil prince, Domhnall mac Ada. Then her mind turned to Constantine, and his anger over Edward. It had been 5 years since she had been south, and she was not the same person who had fled with Thyra and Bocca's baby girl in her clothes, nourishing it with the milk her body still produced even though she had done away with the child growing within her own self. She was a mother now, and that was the only reason she was going. May already be too late, Bocca, knowing nothing about any child, may already be dead. but she had to do this. Edru already had grown, long copper hair like her mother, but her face was Bika's face. Rounded, ears on the large side that stuck out through her hair. Osrith smiled when she thought of Edra. Little Edra, greatest friend of Selach, Constantine's second son. Despite nights when Constantine sought the strange comfort her presence brought him, Osrith had never become with child again. The last had been the one she had used heathen help with, when the root had failed, and Allah had intervened to use lie to flush out the fetus. Edward's, probably. Or her blackmailer. Finan Moore had nursed her from the edge of death, caring for her until she lived. He must have known what she had done and why. He must have realized it could have been his child she had destroyed. Yet he never said a word to her about any of it. And Allah, having provided the result of 4 endings of life within Osrith before that day, had again aided her. 38. And if Osrith had seen all pregnancies through, she would, at 38, have been a mother of 7 by now. Rain and wind began and Osrith sat in the darkness, thinking of Boka. She had intended to write, to tell him he had a daughter. But the longer she had been in Alba the more she had put it off. Boka would appreciate the Gospels, Osrith knew, and she looked at the sheepskin roll, in which she had bound the book from Constantine to Edward. What would he say, though, when she presented him with the flesh and blood image of his dead wife? It was Sainid who woke Osrith, who, despite all odds, had closed her eyes and slept. Constantine was in the throne room, looking pale-faced, but commanding to be room as Osrith remembered his father had once done. He had checked she had Gospels, asking her to pass on his cheatings to Edward, and, with Edra next to him, allowed her to walk to Osrith and wished her well, all as if nothing had passed between them. And as Osrith reiterated her promise to be back by 12th night, she realized exactly why Constantine was sending the Gospels, made in Iona and written in Gaelish, to Edward. Constantine was sending a message, one which told the King of Wessex, I am as scholarly as your father. We are a separate nation, a separate church. Alba is not to be included in your father's vision of uniting kingdoms. Edra waved her hand to the battlements where Constantine watched Sainid help Osrith onto Gert's boat, the blonde Frisian smiling at her, and more so, childlike, as Edra found a seat by the nets before reaching up to take Osrith's hand. Gert had been a boy her age when Osrith had sneaked out of Dunnottar to escape to Wessex, with Sainid's help. This time, her departure was no secret at all, for most of Tby Castle was watching Edra, to all intents and purposes his daughter, leave the royal palace. Could she have left the girl at Winchester? She risked Ethelwold betraying her anyway. But Edra was worth it. And, herring over the quayside, as Gert made to cast off, was Glimry, the old palace cook, pressing food into her hand and lurter skins of water. Or, more likely, Uisbetha then, beside his father, Ildub appeared. Edra cried out to him. In the same way Selach favored Mary, their first son looked just like his father. She cried out and begged to be taken back when Ildub waved back to her. He adored Edra, and she him, and though he was in his teenage years, would still take time from study and swordsmanship to play children's games with her. We will be back by 12th night, Osrith soothed the girl, who cried and cried until they had left sight of the land, until Lindisfarne and Bibbenberg came into view. And then Osrith began a story of everything she knew of Bika, pointing to the monastery, and then to the fortress. There was a long way to go, so she began at the beginning. Sainid, sensing a tale, looked across to her. Bilku of Bernicia was born, just over there. She pointed to the coast of Lothian, where she guessed Melrose must have been. No one knows much about his parents, and one day, the monks opened the doors, and there, in a basket, was a baby.